Well, let's get the conversation rolling. This conversation that we're going to have here about tissue testing. Elston's going to join us very shortly, but we really wanted to get some information out there into the marketplace about tissue testing because as economical and as functional as tissue testing is, Terry, it seems as though there's still a small percentage of the population that's actually tissue testing on a regular basis. So you've been tissue testing for a while. You work with a lot of clients in your agronomic business. How much tissue testing are you seeing out there amongst the general farming population?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, amongst the general farm population, I don't think tissue testing is very widespread. I would think it'd be even less than soil testing. And there's probably a lot of guys that probably should be soil testing more or aren't soil testing. But I know within our agronomic group or the clients that we work with and on our own farm, we're tissue testing quite a bit. And so how we like to look at that is, I mean, when you take your soil test, it's a good snapshot of what's in the soil and what we think is available to the plant. And we use that to formulate our plans, our fertility plans through the winter for what we're going to put on the crops. And that's really important base to start with, but that's just taking a measurement at that time. And so you're building a plan based on a lot of assumptions. The tissue testing, in my mind, is your tests throughout the year to see how well you actually predicted what you needed for that crop and how the plant is accessing it in the soil. And is that fertility program that you've designed working as expected? Because you could just assume that you're really good at what you do as an agronomist or a farmer maybe, and your plan is perfect, and that's great, but you have no way of really checking that until you get to harvest. And if your yield is below what you targeted, you really may not have any idea why that is. So I really like tissue testing. I think that if you're not tissue testing, you're not really getting an understanding of what's going on in the field throughout the year and what's going on with the plans that you made. So I like to use it as a reference for that, as well as also to identify what things are going on within the year. A lot of times growers nowadays are putting something in the tank with their herbicides or whatever it may be, looking at micronutrients and stuff like that. And so again, if you're spending a bunch of money putting some other stuff in the tank, do you know if you're putting the right things in or not, or if you need it at all? And so tissue testing is a pretty minimal cost overall to just identify what's going on throughout the year, maybe make some decisions in season to tweak a few things. And you're also building kind of a history or record of how your crops are performing through wet years, dry years, different seasons that you can look back on over the years and know that, hey, when we have dry, cool conditions, we're usually lacking phosphorus or whatever it may be, right? And so we know that in those conditions on our farm, we might go and put a little bit of something with some extra phos in the tank or something like that. But anyways, yeah, tissue testing has become a big part of the programs that we work with our growers and on our farm.
Soil testing is challenging logistically and physically to get out there and get it all done. It's a big job. Tissue testing, likely less so, but it does take time. Do you think people aren't tissue testing as much because of general awareness, or do you think it's just it takes a lot of time and effort to physically go do it? Because the cost, my understanding is the cost is really nominal.
Yeah, I mean, what we do is through our consulting business, we're charging about $100 a field to do a tissue test if we're doing it for our clients. The analytical cost is less than that. We're charging a bit for our time and providing some input on what the tissue test reads. But really, it's much easier to do logistically and time-wise in soil testing, it's much less intensive. And I just think that probably generally speaking, not in every case, but a lot of guys probably aren't tissue testing as much because maybe they don't just understand what it can do for them, or understand, well, there's Elston. How's it going, buddy? May not understand really how to interpret it. And even when we for tissue testing, there's a lot of different things. And sometimes maybe you can get discouraged or distracted by just trying to understand what you're seeing. But yeah, generally speaking, I just think that guys aren't doing it because they don't understand the value.
There's more awareness.
As much
Elston,
as
you're just joining the conversation. Terry and I are talking about the reasons that perhaps there's not as much tissue testing as common practice as there is soil testing, and perhaps there's more work to be done in the soil testing arena. But I'll do a bit of a reset on the webinar since you just joined us. Happy Father's Day, Elston, and welcome. Speaking of Father's Day, you're dropping your daughter off at school today, which always, comes first, is getting the children an education. We're going to do some education this morning, baby. Get ready. I seen it. This is really cool. I'm excited about how much work you put into this presentation. Frankly, I thought, Elston, you and I and Terry, we're going to have a relatively casual conversation about tissue testing, but I see that you turned the entire battleship around and you got the big guns pointed straight at the literary minds of the students on the webinar this morning. Are you ready to talk tissue testing, Elston?
I think I am. Is everything working here?
Well, it sounds great.
Oh, good. Well, this is very expensive mic. So. No, I'm ready to rumble. And Terry was touching on some really important stuff there. But maybe before we get going and before you boot up my slides and stuff, this morning you asked me about the yield situation out there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So for the group, and I don't know how many are in the group that are semi-suicidal, or at least have farmers that are semi-suicidal, but there you got it. Of the 754 probes that are reporting back from Crop Intelligence, 33% of them are water-driven yield potential positive. So that means anything reporting over 10 bushels above the assigned yield goal for any given field. 33% of the fields are positive. About half of those are actually over 20 bushels over the yield goal. 48% are yield neutral, and only 19% are yield negative. And so if you think about all of that, given that the season to date across all of those probes, we've only received 35% of the average season precipitation to date. That's pretty phenomenal. And I guess this is year 3 or 4 for me. Every year we have the same experience. This year, about half the probes are brand new customers, or people that have gone from one probe to multiple probes. And so one of the biggest leaps of faith in the past is that no one believes the data. And I can tell you, based on a water-driven yield potential basis, you can believe the data. So I thought it was a pretty good news story.
The rain, Elston.
Pardon me?
Is this before or after the recent rains?
It's brand new. You sent me your text or whatever this morning, and I pulled down the data. So it's of this morning.
And how much did that change from previously before we got the rains? What was it? What would this look like?
Well, I mean, these numbers move around a little bit, right? Obviously, a few days ago, it was a little more negative. A few days before that, it was a lot more positive. So the whole model is built on season precipitation to date. And if anything, it's obviously heading in the positive direction. But there's a lot of people that given up a long time ago, and we're barely into it. So I think this data is pretty powerful. Very
pertinent. And as we get to use these tools more and more, I think it'll help us rise above the sentimental psychology, I guess, of what we perceive might be happening versus what technology says is the reality. So with that, I just wanted to welcome the group again. We got a really sizable group, a lot of interest in this topic. I'd like to say hello to each and every one of you in your own special way, because I know all of you to some degree or another. So welcome. But please take the opportunity, if you'd like, as we go through Elston's presentation, to ask your questions. And I think because Elston's put together a substantial amount of material here, we are just going to go through his setup. He's rummaging around in the kitchen now, but we're going to go through his PowerPoint. Terry, are you doing tissue testing as we speak, and you're getting results back now?
Yeah, we haven't got our first results back yet, but should be in a day or two. So I like to, over the years, we've started tissue testing more and more as we've seen the value in it. And what we like to do mostly now is to do tissue tests all the way through the year, 3 or 4 times in the same field, and see what's happening at different times of the year. So yeah, we just started last week or the week before, and so we'll be getting tissue tests back now, and be probably going pretty hard for the rest of the season here now. So,
and how many tissue tests are you doing per field? Are you doing a couple different checks?
Yeah, I'd like to do about 3. We used to try to do every field once during the year, and now we've kind of shifted our strategy to doing less fields, but doing those fields more intensively. And we think we get a better, better overall kind of picture of what we're seeing. But I'm a little bit of a tissue test addict, I have to admit. I've been doing it more and more. And so on our farm, we take usually around 60 tissue tests a year. So that's probably a little bit more than we would for some of our other clients. But we're also doing a lot of different things with trials and our agronomy programs, and use that as kind of a bit of a research. Our farm is a bit of a really big research plot that we use with our agronomy business. So we're a little bit more intense than most guys, but that's where we're at, I guess.
We just had a question here from Jason Barish. Thanks so much. Where do you send your tissue samples to?
Right now, we're sending them to Midwest Labs, which is in the States, which is kind of the lab that we used to use with Agritrend. We have a good relationship with them, but we've sent to A&L. I think AgVise does a good job. So I think there's quite a few labs out there that do a good job with tissue testing, and I'm not sure it matters where you send them to. Elsa might have a better viewpoint on that.
Yeah, well, my viewpoint is pretty simple. It's the lab. There's lots of good labs. If you can pick Midwest, you can pick A&L, you can pick a lot of different labs. Just be consistent, because different labs have different criteria and different ways of interpretation and presentation. And as Terry was talking earlier, part of the reason people don't take as many tissue samples as they probably should is because they're confused in many cases. And so by adding a bunch of different labs in there, you just add to the level of confusion. So pick a lab. They're all pretty good. Stick with that lab and learn a bunch of stuff. And I really liked the comments that Terry made, and it's probably one of the reasons why he's pretty darn successful. And that is, in my mind, and I've thought this for a long time, is that it's way more important to take more samples per field than to sample more fields, because the amount of information or the amount of learning that happens with that strategy is orders of magnitude higher than taking one tissue sample per every field. They're both good strategies, but the one where you take multiple samples per field is the winner. Winner, chicken dinner. So, yeah.
Hey, we had a question here before we move on to the tissue testing slides here, just about the geographical reach of the aforementioned crop intelligence.
Well, we got probes. The bulk of the probes are still in Saskatchewan. Alberta has grown substantially. Montana has added some probes, and Manitoba is dabbling. So the bulk of the data intensity is actually in Saskatchewan, and we've got some probes in Australia. Obviously, they're not in the data set that I've shared with you, but yeah, that's the geography.
Okay, well, I'm going to share these slides here.
All right, thanks, Dano, and good to be on the panel with Terry and yourself, and to be speaking to a bunch of folks out there that are obviously pushing the envelope. This is just a small subset of a larger presentation that I put together a year or so ago to try to coalesce some of the basics of tissue sampling. And before I get started here, I think what I would like to say too, and it relates back to what Terry was saying on his farm, where he takes multiple tissues per field from fewer fields. The other way, the way I kind of think of that is that if we as farmers, or we as people helping farmers, have a set analytical budget for the farm, say it's something happened there, say it is $8 an acre analytical budget for your coaching and for the analytics. As we've built a foundation of soil test information, I believe very, very strongly that more and more of the analytical budget should be moved to tissue sampling and tissue test interpretation, mainly because there are many, many things we can do in crop to enhance our yield potential and to enhance our quality. And we combine the information that's made available by crop intelligence with tissue testing and some of the stuff that that we can connect the dots with. It's very, very powerful financially and also intellectually. Yeah, and so I always kind of have a little bit of fun when I do these things. So there's a lot of people out there that are trying to be awesome, but if you click forward, if you're mostly Norwegian, then you're just naturally awesome. And so that's just the intro. Most of you might know me, and for those that don't, I'm Elston Solberg, and I've been a big proponent of tissue testing for a long, long time. I must admit, there was a period in my life where I was a knucklehead. Maybe I still am, but I always thought that tissue testing was about the immediate. It wasn't until I realized that tissue testing and interpretation is about not only the immediate, but also the past, and it foreshadows the future. And so once you, in my mind, if you wrap your head around that one, tissue testing becomes more and more important, because those analytics tell you a little bit about what the plant has been experiencing in the past, maybe even past years, tells you what it's experiencing today, and it's foreshadowing the future, not unlike a blood test for a human being. And so I didn't figure that one out till I was in my 40s. And for those younger agronomists on the call that were maybe a little bit like me back in the day, when the only thing I thought about tissue testing was that it was about the immediate, get that out of your head and realize that it's about a lot more than that. And then your whole perception of tissue testing will change. Next, Daniel. So like I said, if you think about tissue testing as like a human's blood test, that blood test tells you a lot about your past behavior. It tells the doctor a lot about your current state of health, and it tells you what to expect for the future. Now, there's a big difference. Hopefully all of us on this call are going to live to be 80 to 140 years old. I know Dan's got even a longer goal than that. What is the newest goal, Dan?
I'm holding steady at 189 with stretch goal to 240. Yeah, and I'm living every day absolutely as if, you know.
Well, there you go. You're right on the
chamber.
You and Terry are kind of in the sweet spot. I'm past it, but if some of the projections come true, that stuff might be possible. So
we can have a question here, Elston. We have an amazing question here from the group, Tom Benson. Thank you. Does that mean you test the older leaves on the plant, not just the newest, fastest growing leaves?
It depends. And this is where it gets sticky. And as a soil scientist, I believe that we get taught to confuse the shit out of folks.
Why is every answer in agronomy, it depends?
Well, today isn't about it depends. Today is about how to get started. And so my suggestion for folks on the call, click it forward.
Okay.
Dano.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Ouch.
My suggestion for the purposes of the call today, and for what we need to get accomplished here in this growing season yet, is that we sample the newest, youngest fully elongated leaf. Okay, the reason we picked the youngest fully elongated leaf, the newest leaf, is that leaf represents or integrates the conditions that plant is experiencing at that moment in time. And it's about a 5 or 6 week window within which we have an opportunity to react and grab more yield and grab more quality. Now, having said all of that, there are circumstances where we might comparatively sample the old leaf versus the new leaf. And this might be a good spot for Terry to pop in and talk about his experiences there. I don't know if that's fair to Terry, but you got any comments there, Terry?
No, I think
his audio. Okay, so I'll dive into the weeds here a little bit, given that Terry's having trouble with his audio. The other reason we picked the newest leaf is that there's only 4 nutrients that can be cannibalized, okay? So if there are only 4 nutrients that can be cannibalized from the old leaves and moved to the new leaves, obviously the symptomology is going to appear on the old leaves. And those 4 nutrients, of the 20 that a plant needs, are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. So if we're trying to fix something that's going on inside the field, inside the crop in the short term, for today's purposes, let's analyze the newest leaf. If you want to get ambitious and you want to learn a whole lot of stuff, my slides went way down.
Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to get a different view here. Carry on.
That's okay. If you want to learn a whole bunch of stuff, especially for the younger agronomists in the crowd, pick a few fields and sample them multiple times in the growing season and sample the old tissue and the new tissue, and the amount of learning that you will acquire in one season will be orders of magnitude ahead of sampling a whole bunch of fields once. I don't know if that answers the question. I don't want to confuse the situation more than it already is, but that comparison of old.
So to sum it up, you're saying 80% of the time the new leaves.
Yeah, at least, yes, exactly. Yep, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So, yep.
So you got the slides back up. Does that work for you? I just wanted to minimize it. So
yeah, it's working. It works fine.
Okay, perfect.
So the Aberhart Ag Solutions folks have put together this one-pager that basically lays out the steps of how to go about stuff. Talks about supplies. It talks about conditions. It talks about sampling and the whole process. And I think it's simple. And anything that's can make a complex topic simpler is a good thing. And again, for the purposes of today's talk and for the purposes of this season, I think as simple as we can make it is a really positive deal. So the list basically is this. You want to collect samples in paper bags. You want to make sure your hands are clean, or you could use nitrile gloves. They're always very sexy. Sample the newest leaf or leaves. Some people with some crops will sample the top 3 inches as an example. The main point here is stay consistent and tell the lab what you did. If we want to dive into the weeds of variability of the analytics, morning sampling is less variable than afternoon, especially for nutrients like potassium. If herbicide or something fairly impactful has been applied, the rule of thumb is to allow the crop enough time to grow a new leaf before you get out there and sample. In other words, to let the crop metabolize whatever it is that you've put on it, and that would include fertilizer, fungicide, other things. And then collect enough leaf material to form a loosely packed softball-sized ball of biomass. So you don't need a bale. You just need a small, loosely packed sized ball of biomass. You put the stuff in a bag. You keep the bag open. So you don't close the bag. You don't freeze the bag. You keep the bag open and let it air dry on the dash of the truck or car or whatever. And you send it to the lab and stay consistent with the lab. And we've already talked about that here a while.
Is there a window under which you want to get that tissue material to the lab? Is there a window past which you would say, well, we don't want to submit these?
Not if the material's dry. If the material is relatively dry, there's no big time crush, but obviously the sooner the better.
We have a question here from the one of the guests here. Thank you, Eric Pateman. Can we use previous year's tissues as a guide to see if we are in line with previous year's yields?
Holy crap. That's an awesome question, which is really an awesome comment. And that's what I was talking about before, is that an old tissue from last year or the year before will guide you this year. And the example that I would use is that if you've got a boron deficiency in your wheat last year, you can pretty much be guaranteed that you're going to have a boron deficiency in your canola this year. Or if you've got a copper deficiency in your canola last year, you can be pretty darn sure you're going to have a copper deficiency in your wheat this year. Now, we can argue about whether canola actually responds to copper or not. It probably doesn't, but it foreshadows the future. And so if that's what Eric was alluding to, absolutely.
Great question.
Great question.
Maybe just a couple of things to add there, Elston, on the collecting of the samples. When you're talking about making sure your hands are clean and stuff, I mean, I think it's pretty important too that everyone knows the most important thing is that you don't get dirt or dust on the plant material. So like when the plants are smaller, say in cereals, I just take the top leaves. I actually just go and either take a scissors and cut them off or just twist them off with my hand. But you want to be careful that you don't end up, say, pulling up a root and getting soil contamination in the bag. Or if the plants are dusty, I'm not sure what your comments are about washing or not. Some people maybe wash the samples. I'm not sure what your comments on there, but yeah, I mean, it's just keep them dry and dry it down, and then that sample could be sent in a year later if you wanted, if it's dry, because that's all they do in the lab is they dry it down before it goes through the analysis, right? So
yeah, great comments. One of the biggest contaminants, like we speak a lot about contamination from your hands and stuff, which that's true, but the biggest problem with contamination is from the soil. And Terry, if you knew how many tissue samples that I've washed with distilled water, it's got to be distilled water, because tap water can be loaded with a lot of different shit. If you knew how many samples that I've washed in my career with distilled water, that's a big, big number. And so one of the issues with some of the folks on the call is sulfur in particular. You'll get a tissue sample coming back with a high level of sulfur in it, and one of the defaults that some labs will make is that the sample has been contaminated by soil. The way to tell whether or not your sample has been contaminated by soil is to look at the sodium and iron numbers. And if they're extremely elevated, you know you have soil contamination. If they're not, you're good. So that's a little tidbit that can be helpful.
We also have a comment here that Ken Farker's agronomist says to have samples cold and moist.
Cold and moist? I'm not under. Well, I'm a big believer in not moist and dry.
Okay.
It's I mean the only other
it's Twitter war coming on here.
Yeah. No, well, okay. So the other way to go is to freeze them. That's a possibility. But if you have samples and you put them in sealed bags and they're wet, and those bags are flopping around in your truck, whether they're paper or plastic or whatever, you're now introducing another variable, and that's called the organisms that are on the plant in moist conditions. They can start, whether it's cool or whatever, they can start living and doing some nasty things in there. So you either got to freeze them, keep them as cold as possible, or I prefer just keeping them in an open bag and letting them start to air dry. That's my preference.
The lab will tell you if there's been contamination by soil in general?
They'll guesstimate. Like we've seen a lot of samples the last few years with really high sulfur numbers as a consequence of using biosol. And, there's just default things that come up on the analytics that come back, and they say this sample possibly was contaminated with soil. But like I said, if you look at the iron numbers and the sodium numbers, if they're low, then there's no contamination by soil. If they're elevated, then that assumption is possibly true.
So that's probably one of the most eloquent under the radar plugs that I've heard in recent memory for Biosol. The tissue test lab can hardly believe the levels of sulfur because they're so high. It must be contaminated. We'll just leave that there.
Yeah.
Moving on.
So just a little bit of fun. Like again, you need a sample of loosely packed leaves that is about the size of a fastball. So that's too small. That's not enough.
Okay.
That's not enough. That's too much.
I love these graphic representations driving your point home.
So there's a glove and there's a fastball inside the glove, and
good.
That's about the size you need to think. So we need to think a little bit differently. So why tissue test? So there was a question a while ago about old and new leaves, and there's basically three reasons why we tissue test. Number one, a lot of people that are out there walking fields, they see good areas and they see bad areas. It's always a good idea if you want to learn a lot about what's going on is to take tissue samples and soil samples from the poor areas and the good areas, and we call that diagnostic tissue testing. And then there's the learning that was alluded to earlier by Terry and the question, and that is taking multiple tissues from the same field. And if you want to get really funky, while you're doing that, take old leaves versus new leaves, and you will learn way more about the physiology of a plant or a crop from doing that than you will in a university course. And for me today, I think today is about making and saving money with in-crop decisions. And so
can you drill down on that, Elston? If you got a 5,000 acre farm, how many fields should you be tissue testing, or what's the range of frequency across the whole farm?
Well, in a perfect world, you'd be sampling all of your fields 2 or 3 times. And that's what I was trying to get at earlier, is that if you've got an analytical budget of whatever, so many dollars per acre, shift more, in my humble opinion, especially after you've had a few soil sampling rounds, shift more of that analytical budget to tissue sampling, because the data that's coming back there will help you make better and better decisions as you grow forward.
So just to do some math, if you're tissue testing with services like Terry's at $100 a pop twice a year on 34 quarter sections, roughly 5,000 acres, that's about $7,000 budget to tissue test everything on the farm twice.
There you go.
21 grand for a farm like Terry's. Is it worth 21 grand to a farm? A 15,000 acre farm?
Well, I think what I always look at, and I think a lot of people get hung up on, is they look at that and they think, oh, well, depends how you frame the numbers. It seems like a lot of money, but the reality is, our fertilizer budget's over $100 an acre, so that's $1.5 million on our farm. So does 20 grand to make sure that it's probably less than 1% of what our total fertilizer budget is, to help understand if what you're doing is correct, or you can cut back, or in one area or need more. It's actually a very, very nominal cost when you frame it in that way. So I always like to look at these type of things as they're an input. They're just as important input. Guys will go throw $8 an acre foliar whatever in with their herbicide and not really think too much about it, whether they need it or not, or it's got the right balance of micros or not, or that your crop is looking for. So I just think you're probably throwing a lot of money away on your nutrient plan if you don't really know what you need. So the things that we like the most about working with tissues is stuff, especially like sulfur. Sulfur is a great example of, we don't really even look at our tissue tests because we are on an elemental sulfur program.
You mean soil tests?
Our soil tests. We don't really look at our sulfur and our soil tests. We use our tissue tests so that we know that crop is getting what it needs throughout the year. Now, things like nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff like that are a little bit more relevant on the soil tests for sure. But things like micros, as Elston was saying, I mean, we've soil tested micros across the whole farm. And then we'll go for quite a few years where we're not testing the micros, because we're not, generally speaking, variable rating our micros in our nutrient plan. But we are at many times putting in some zinc or boron, depending on the year in the fields and the conditions. And we are doing that based off what our tissues are showing. So like a lot of things, I think it's kind of like paying $1,000 a year for a market newsletter when you're making decisions on selling grain that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's just a small amount to get some more accurate information to make better decisions.
Interesting perspective.
Well, if you do the math on your example, it's $1.40 an acre. And guys make, as Terry mentioned, $5, $8, $12, $30 decisions. Boom, 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 boom.
This is what I'm kind of sitting here wondering, and as far be it for me to say, because obviously I'm not in the act of farming myself and determining what dollars are going to go where on that acre. But is it fair to say maybe there's a kind of a feel good thing about throwing $8 into the tank versus $1.50 and going out and doing the laborious work of tissue testing?
Could be, or that's where you get somebody like Terry or some of his people to do that laborious stuff for you. But at the end of the day, the multiple samples per field per year provides you with the best information to make timely in-crop decisions that can dramatically impact your bottom line. And at the end of the day, everybody on this call knows that we got to make money. And so $1.40 an acre to make a bunch more money or save a bunch more money is a pretty small investment from where I'm sitting.
When you look at your tissue test, is it a proactive thing where you look at it and you say, okay, this is what I'm going to add next? Or is it a reactive thing where you can see issues and correct them in time not to suffer that yield loss or that income loss, given what the tissue test is telling you.
Yes and yes. So to the second piece, if you're seeing that your crop is suffering, particularly when it comes to nutrients, I learned something or relearned something, I guess, fairly significant this winter from Ishmael Chakmak. What he said was simply this, that if you see a magnesium deficiency, and I'm just using magnesium as the example, by the time you see the deficient symptoms, that crop has suffered for at least 3 weeks. So now you're into a reactive rescue situation as opposed to a proactive get ahead of the game situation. There's a lot of things that we don't see that are stressing crops out. And if on the nutrient side, if we have information that tells us that crop is starting to be stressed by X, Y, or Z, or the nutrient ratios are out of balance, we can pull triggers a lot quicker than 21 days too late. And that's pretty powerful. Back to Eric's question, if you know that last year's crop was suffering from X, Y, and Z, chances are this year's crop is going to have similar issues, depending on a whole bunch of stuff, but chances are, so you're ahead of the game. Now you're being proactive instead of reactive.
Can you sum up a crop manager's level of awareness in the decision-making process if they're doing 2 tissue tests per field every year for 5 to 10 years versus someone who isn't doing any of it ever?
Terry's smiling. I'll let him tackle that one.
Well, just to add to Elston's comments there. I mean, for me personally, it's kind of 50-50 making decisions in season and tweaking things to what's going on that year. And the other 50% is learning over time. And one example of that is, typically in general, growers focus a lot on nitrogen. It's easy to talk guys into nitrogen, but we've seen year over year on our farm and the majority of our clients' farms where potassium is always low, especially later in the season when the crop really needs it. And we're always we all know how to manage nitrogen really well. And in all honesty, we're over managing nitrogen, over applying nitrogen in almost all cases. And we've seen this over 10 years of tissue testing and literally thousands of tissue tests. And so we've been working harder at pushing our K up, putting higher levels of K on, and actually reducing our nitrogen at the same time. And last year, as an example, we finally got to where we were broadcasting some K and stuff like that, and seen some of our best tissue test levels in our crops throughout the whole season. And maybe it was partly the year too as well, but we did have record-breaking yields in our wheat and barley and canola on all our crops, and in correlation with some of the best tissue test levels of K that we've seen in the history that I've been kind of working on that. So, I mean, those are the type of things that you can do some tweaking within the season with what you're putting in your spray tank, and maybe if you're top dressing and things like that. But as well, you can really correlate things over time. And the same thing when we switched over to Biosol from using Tiger 90, we always had pretty strong tissue test levels with our Tiger 90 program, but we've seen an even stronger response once we moved to Biosol. And then you can compare, 3 years of using Biosol versus the 3 years before across all your crops. What's the average? And we increased the average percentage of sulfur in our plants by 25%. So either way, whatever that product is that you're using, hey, that's a good decision. Your program is performing better than what you were using before. So keep doing that. And if you don't have that result, then you maybe want to change your strategy or look at something different.
Well, that's another rather eloquent plug, and I'll just take that moment to plug what we're going to be looking at next next month with Matt Gosling. This is actually the soil test, but this is a cumulative soil test across premium ag clients. It's a substantial agronomy business, much like yours, Terry, in Strathmore, Alberta. When in 2013 they started applying Biosol, and they also have Matt also sent me the tissue tests percentage of deficiency versus adequacy, which we'll look at as well. I can bring this up here. That'll be something that we talk about next month as well. So I think we'll continue on. It's some great conversation. Let's continue on here with your slides, Elston. Is that fair to say that'd be the next move here, is to continue on with your slides?
Yeah, I just want to follow up with what Terry just said. There was some really profound stuff there that, as I mentioned, I didn't figure out till later in my career. So what we've learned over the last 20 some years of doing all this kind of stuff is that there's 3 ratios within your tissues that we need to get focused on right out of the gate. And the first ratio is your N to S ratio. All right. So your N to S ratio for lots of different reasons. Your second ratio is your N to K ratio. And actually, once you get those 2 ratios in line, your system starts to get much, much more efficient. And then the third ratio is your calcium to boron ratio. And once you got those 3 ratios humming inside your crops, your plants, your whole system starts to really, really get more efficient from a nutrient use perspective, from water use perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So some really profound stuff that Terry just said, and that's really good. Yep.
Yeah, we had a great question from Ivan, and it seems like you just answered it. Either you read it or you're that intuitive in the universe that you just intuited that you should speak about ratios.
I have the odd moment where I am fairly intuitive. I know, it's scary.
Monday morning revelation. Whoa. Okay. I'll give just your slides back here. I take it that question's answered. Ivan, if you want us to clarify any further on ratios, I have a feeling Elston's going to talk a little bit more about ratios as we go here. Yeah.
No, not really. But in terms of the ratios, and so this is where things get complicated, and this is where people say, this is too freaking complicated. I'm not going to do this. The art of tissue test interpretation, if you can put that slide up again, is...
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. The art of the interpretation of the tissue test is that you as an agronomist, you need to integrate all of the stuff that's on the screen, and not happen overnight. It's just like a hockey player doesn't decide one day he's going to be jump to the NHL and jumps into the NHL. You got to learn to integrate a whole bunch of stuff, because that's what the plant is doing. And this is one of the reasons why tissue sampling is, in my mind, so important, in that it integrates all of the stuff that's going on in the field at the moment in time, but it also integrates the stuff that went on in the field previously, and it foreshadows the future. And so I've said all of that many, many times. So to Ivan's question, the ratios, the N to S ratios, the N to K ratios, and the calcium to boron ratios are going to be different for different crops, and they're going to be different for different growth stages within those crops. And so that's another level of integration that's required. Thankfully, the labs do a pretty good job of doing that integration for us. But at the end of the day, one of the biggest reasons tissues are so important is that they integrate a whole bunch of stuff. And as agronomists, that provides us an opportunity to say, okay, the plant is showing these levels of nutrient, the weather's been this, the soil's been that, et cetera, and you in a fairly short period of time can turn into a diagnostic superstar if you want to be. And
if you want to be a diagnostic superstar, what do you got to do, Elston? You got to sign up for what? You got to sign up for earth, dirt,
soil, folks.
There you go.
Just do
Earth-rich
it.
soil will help you get there. Absolutely.
I got a question here. Thank you, Edgar, for joining and providing this very technical question. Terry indicated a potassium response being seen in the tissue samples. What were the ammonium acetate potassium soil tests saying?
Yeah, so
I'm glad I could pronounce that. Thank you. Thank you for that very technical question. Challenging my English reading skills.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so generally speaking, I mean, probably like a lot of soils in Western Canada here, but you know, our parts per million of potassium on a soil test would show quite high, and you know, I know that the Western Ag Lab guys with the probes there really have this figured out very well with the potassium response. But the reality is, even though parts per million in the soil are really high, a lot of people think we don't need potassium in the crop or for that crop. But we have really high mag soils and other things that tie up the potassium. So like our K to Mg ratios on the soil tests are really low, and the availability of potassium is not good, and it gets tied up very quickly. And so this is where, you know, the soil test would show, depending on what you're looking at on the soil test and how well you understand the interpretation, that, hey, you got lots of potassium, don't worry about it. You're crazy to put any on. But the tissue tests are showing that, hey, you're low on potassium. For whatever reason, the plant is not getting that potassium into the plant. And I mean, the Western Labs probes kind of simulate a bit better what the plant would actually see in uptake. But yeah, so that's another reason why the tissue tests are really valuable, is because they can kind of prove to you whether the crop is getting what the soil test thinks it should or not, or if there's other issues going on there.
Yeah, just to follow.
Don't necessarily have to understand. Yeah, sorry. Don't necessarily have to understand all the deeper science of why, and have your, you know, if you're a bit of a layman on those kind of things, try to figure that all out. It just simply, if the tissue test shows you're not getting it, you got to figure out how to get the plant what it needs.
Elston?
Just to follow up on what Terry was saying, last week I was down in southern Alberta on some fields near Lethbridge. Monster hybrid rye crop growing there, just unbelievable. Tissue test, despite the soil tests having 200 parts per million of phosphorus and over 50 parts per million of zinc, the plants are absolutely devastated by low phosphorus and zinc. Doesn't make any sense at a traditional level of all the stuff we read. 200 parts per million of phosphorus, that's Olsen phosphorus, 50 plus parts per million of zinc. How is it possible for this crop to be low on both? And that's the beauty of it. Now there's an agronomic challenge, an agronomic opportunity to figure out what's going on in this situation, to help this crop this year, maybe, but more importantly, to help the crops growing into the future. So obviously there's something getting in the way of the plant's ability to take up those two key nutrients in that given situation. So the potassium one, we see it all the time. We've got really big crops. We got really strong, nitrogen and sulfur, but our potash sucks despite the fact that our soil is presumably high in potassium. And I agree with Terry, the Western Ag guys, with their technology. There's some real cool advantages or opportunities there as well to tie that further to tissues. Thought that for a long time, and maybe someday that will happen in a big way.
Awesome conversation. I love it. So let's keep rolling here in the interest of time through your slides. If you have more to add yet, Elston?
No, we're good. Just continue to the next slide. And really, this one is just a repeat of what we've said here over and over and over again. We're talking about integration of a lot of stuff. Don't let don't let the whole conversation about tissue testing and interpretation intimidate you. Get started. If you want to get started, and most of you have been started, but if you want to get started in a big way, take multiple tissue samples per field, tissue the old leaves and the new leaves, and I guarantee you within a year you will learn so much your brain will about explode. Now, this is one of the issues when it comes to interpretation. Labs express the nutrients within the plant based on a concentration basis. So you can have a monster plant and a little twiddly-ass little plant side by each, and they can give you the same tissue test analysis. And that's because on a concentration basis, you need to take into account the relative mass or vigor of the plant. And a lot of people get confused by that. But I used this presentation with a bunch of university students a few months ago. The analogy I came up with is next. So, looking at beer.
Something we can all relate to.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to this. And that's the analogy. So, on the left-hand side, you got 2 5% beers. Which one contains more alcohol? On a concentration basis, they're identical. But on a let's fall down basis, it's obvious which one is. And then the same token, the mugs on the right, one's got way less alcohol nutrient, and the other one's got way more.
I guess for those attendees that are coming to Farm Progress, we could test this out in the real world.
Yeah, I've replicated this experiment thousands of times. So I can tell you what the conclusion will be, but hopefully that analogy works too. And then this is something that kind of bumped into my head again fairly recently. And one of the problems with soil sampling and identifying issues across fields is that soil-borne nutrients can be extremely variable, sulfur probably being the most variable. So let's use that as an example. Soil sulfur analysis can give you values in any given field from 2 parts per million to 2,000. That's 1,000x variability. The plant is integrating everything that's going on around it, and it's really difficult to get even 2% sulfur in a canola plant, 0.5% sulfur in a wheat plant. And so essentially the plant system, the crop system is integrating all of the stuff that's going on with it. It's integrating all that variability so that now the variability between those tissue samples versus those soil samples is 2 orders of magnitude less. And from a interpretation perspective, that's a really big thing. And I don't know if that all makes sense to everybody, but at least I'll throw it out there and people can chew on it a little bit. But essentially what I'm saying is the plant integrates the variability that's around it, and the decisions we can make around a range of 1.8% versus 2,000 parts per million at a practical level is much, much better. And then finally, I think when should we tissue test? Well, I glibly say any time's a good time to tissue test. Even the grain. Send your grain off for analysis. That's a great time to get a tissue test too, because your grain's going to tell you a lot about what happened in the growing season. But really, for practical money-making purposes, we're looking at the physiological growth stage, the equivalent. I'm using wheat here from about the 5-leaf stage to flag leaf, because that's the window within which we can do the most damage economically. We can capture the most yield. We can capture the most quality. That's the window within which we can do the most good if we have issues in a crop. Of course, there's other windows, but that's the primary window. So if I was going to apportion my analytical budget to fields and sample more than once on many fields, I would probably pick about the 5-leaf growth stage and about the flag leaf And if I wanted to get funky, I might pick one in between. And the main reason is those two sampling stages allow us to make decisions. The early one, primarily about macros, the later one, primarily about micros. Those would be my two windows. And again, just to reiterate why we sample the newest tissue, there's only 4 nutrients that can be harvested from the old tissue and moved to the new tissue. That means all 16 of the rest of them are going to express themselves in the new tissue. And so if we're going to just sample one part of the plant, that's part of the reason why we select the newest tissue. It's going to be most reflective of what's going on with the most amount of nutrients. And back to the process that Aberhart Ag Solutions come up with. That's very simple. Get your stuff together. Make sure your hands are clean. You got nitrile gloves. Get out there and sample. As we mentioned earlier, by sampling the newest leaf or the newest leaves, just be consistent. The morning is less variable than the afternoon, especially if you're trying to tackle the potassium issue that we talked about before. Either freeze the samples or keep them really cold immediately, or I prefer to put them in a paper bag and let them air dry. Grab that softball size amount of sample, jam it in that bag, get it, send it away, get your results back, and figure out a strategy to deal with whatever's going on in that crop. It's pretty straightforward if we're just trying to target that money-making window. And with that, I'm sure there's going to be 1 or 2 questions. That's just a picture of someplace, arguably in Norway or the Matterhorn. I think the next one's the better one, though.
How do we get away from using single-use plastic bags in your own tissue testing business, Elston? Are you switching to paper, plastic bags, or?
I've always except for some really weird research stuff that I did back in the day, I've always only used paper bags.
Boom. I see that Alyssa has posted the Aberhart tissue sampling method link in the chat, and I think we've sent that out if you've when you registered, and we'll continue to share resources like that. And tissue testing is near and dear to our heart, of course, because of the differences. And
Daniel, can you go back to that summary slide, please?
I sure can. Sorry
to interrupt.
Which one are you? The second last one?
The cycle, that the stuff you're putting on, that one.
Perfect.
Okay, so some of you on there are probably reading this and you're looking at number 3, the sampling thing. And what is said here is perfect. It's bang on the money, but I'm guessing for most of us on the call, we're probably managing a lot of fields based on zones. And so what a lot of agronomists will do when you're managing fields based on zones is they'll basically pick, say, zone 2 being the representative of the bulk of the field. It's not the highest yield potential, but it represents the bulk of the field. And then they use the data that comes from zone 2, and with a little bit of agronomic skullduggery, they apply that information to the higher yielding zones and the lower yielding zones. So, I mean, we could get into the whole conversation about should we sample zones independently, and certainly there'll be some additional information there for sure. But I think the common strategy is to pick your zone 2 in most cases and utilize that information across your fields, recognizing it's not your highest yielding area, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of like crop intelligence.
Love it. Some really, really good information. It does not look like we have any further questions. So I think with that, I think we're going to wrap up this tissue testing talk. Thanks, Elston, for providing your wisdom and mentorship on this as usual. And Terry, thanks for giving us a perspective, an agronomist and a farmer. We hope that the coverage of tissue testing in terms of the economics, the agronomics, the logistics, the why, the when, the where, the how, the what for, was useful to you in your business. Really appreciate all the attendance. We had 30 attendees this morning. That's incredible. So
Sweet.
we will be recording this, sending this out. We'll be sharing some of the more coherent, cognizant, pertinent moments on social media in 30-second to 1-minute clips. No charge for that. But we appreciate everyone we had the opportunity to do business with and share knowledge with in the agricultural community. And hey, chins up, folks. We've got some rain. We're still in the game. Let's get at her, pitter patter. We're not out yet. Hashtag Western Canadian Ag. So Terry wants the last word. We'll give it to Terry.
Yeah, just a quick comment. There's one question there that we maybe missed just on the turnaround time for tissue tests.
Yeah.
Typically, for us, it's kind of 5 to 7 business days, depending on what lab it's going to and
good catch.
A bunch of other stuff. But kind of usually can get results back in 5 to 7 days.
Any last words, Elston?
No, except, there's 30 people on the call. And if you think about the number of acres that each one of those individuals impacts times 30, and you think about that footprint, and hopefully some of them also are incorporating the crop intelligence stuff, the number gets to be a really big number really fast. And it's that the reason I was put on this planet was to do shit like this. So, if we can think about it in those terms and also recognize that, yeah, it's dry out there and yeah, there's situations, but 33% of the fields are trending yield positive and 16% of those fields are trending way yield positive, and actually only 20% are trending negative. So as bad as it might seem and everything else, it's things like this that can make a really big difference, I hope, as we grow into the future. So thanks for the opportunity. I can do this all day long, every day. That's why I'm on this planet. And this is just a small snippet of the whole conversation. So if people want to talk more about the bigger conversation, we can figure something out in that regard.
Awesome. Just give me a chance here. I just want to double check the Q&As. Okay, we just, Jenica Grant added A&L Labs is 2 to 3 days turnaround. Jack Dawes says thank you. We had a few other people say thank you. And the exponential power networks at work. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's going to depend a lot on where you're located and the shipping and stuff. So right where we are, it usually takes a day or two longer just with shipping to get anywhere because we're in the middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan.
And then there's the time change, Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, the vortex. There's a whole bunch of factors going on here. But hey, guys, next month we're going to do a webinar. Go ahead, Elston.
I got something else that I think is reasonably important. There's some new technology coming along, guys, that gets rid of this turnaround time. If it works, and there's 3 different technologies where you can utilize them right in your field and literally get an instantaneous answer. So this is the point. If we've got our homework done and we've got an understanding of a foundational understanding of soil analysis and tissue analysis, and now along comes this new tech where we can actually get data right in the field, almost in real time. What does that do to our ability to make even better decisions? And what does that mean in terms of some of the possibilities for the future? If we don't have the foundational understanding of how to integrate soil tests with tissue tests, with all of the other factors that a crop is experiencing, we won't get as big a bang for our buck when the new tech hits. And there is stuff right on the edge where literally you can get the analysis of your tissues in real time. No wait for the lab.
So I take it you're just extrapolating here. I take it you're talking about Star Trek type technology where you can transport organic material without loss of life, vast distances through space.
Not really.
Oh.
an analytical tools that can do the analysis right in the field. They're right on the edge. And my point is that if we don't have the foundation of the tissue test understanding and some beginning of the integration, we're going to lose an opportunity there as well. So the sooner the better, and don't be a knucklehead like I was till I was about 44. So that's all I got.
The future is here. It's just unevenly distributed out of Elston's brain.
You got her, man.
So next month we're going to feature Matt Gosling, who's got tens of thousands of acres, agronomically speaking, under his stewardship via his clients who've been using Biosol since 2013. And we're going to deep dive into those results and his experience going through that evolution with his clients. It's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be much the same, similar format. Elston, are you wanting to join us on that one too, maybe?
You bet.
What do you got there?
I don't know.
Can you hold it up closer?
Bobblehead.
I feel like I can't. Hold that up closer? That's a predator. Okay. All right. Oh, that's Chewbacca. All right. Bobblehead. Star Wars bobblehead. Okay, we're gonna have to get bobblehead made at Elston here. But anyways, thanks everybody for coming on the call. Appreciate it so much. Good luck out there, and hopefully we'll see you at Farm Progress. We'll be there all 3 days. Are you coming to Farm Progress, Terry?
Not sure yet.
I see. Depends what the tissue tests say.
That's right.
All right, folks, keep it real. Thanks so much. Good luck out there, and we'll see you around the rodeo shortly. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Terry.
Thanks everybody.
Elston. Bye for now.
Adios, amigos.
Keep it real.